Adirondack High Peaks, New York, August 1948. The air was still warm, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but the angle of the sun already held a warning. Winter was a predator in these mountains, and it stalked the calendar. For the men gathered by the county road, watching Bruno Calligaris work, the season's threat made the scene before them less a curiosity and more an offense. Bruno was building a wall. Not a foundation, not a fence, not a house. Just a wall, standing alone in the middle of his cleared acre. It was a massive, curving crescent of stone, a half-moon aimed at the unforgiving north. He worked with a rhythm that was alien to them, a quiet economy of motion that wasted nothing. He'd select a stone, turn it over in his calloused hands, seeing its secrets, then place it with a soft, grating finality. There was no mortar, only a careful packing of gravel and clay between the courses. Roy Latimer, the Saranac Lake assessor, leaned against the fender of his Ford, arms crossed. He was a man whose authority came from ledgers and tax codes, and he saw nothing in his books that accounted for this. "It's a folly," he said, not to Bruno, but to the two farmers beside him, Silas Croft and Jedediah Morse. A 10-foot pile of rocks. He spent 2 months on it. The Quonset itself is barely livable, and he's building a stone monument to foolishness. Behind the strange wall sat the source of Latimer's official displeasure, a surplus Wankerfige Quonset hut. A long, corrugated metal tube, cheap and fast to erect, it was the solution for dozens of returning GIs and their new families. It was also, as everyone knew, a death trap in an Adirondack winter if you couldn't feed the stove every hour of the night. Jedediah Morse spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Heard in town he's Italian. Maybe they build things different over there." "They must," Latimer grunted. "That thing won't stop a breeze. It's got more gaps than a picket fence. He came to my office last week asking for a Class 3 dwelling assessment. I told him straight. You want to be a house, you build a house. Box that metal tube in a proper 4-sided wood frame, insulate it, and I'll sign the papers. Otherwise, it's an outbuilding. And that's shed-grade work." He gestured with his chin at the rising curve of stone. "Crazy." Bruno Calligaris heard the word, carried on the breeze. He did not turn. He simply set another 50-pound stone, nudging it into place as if it were a sleeping child. The mockery lasted for the rest of the afternoon. The validation would take a winter of impossible cold. What did this quiet Friulian drystoner understand about aerodynamic wakes and radiative shields that the seasoned, practical men of the Adirondacks had missed? This channel is dedicated to the stories of forgotten innovators who solved impossible problems with the wisdom they carried in their hands. The story of Bruno Calligaris is more than a tale of a strange wall. It's a lesson in seeing the invisible forces that shape our world. I promise, if you stay with me, you will learn how a simple curve of stone can tame a polar vortex. To support more stories like this, take a moment to subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss what's next. Let me know in the comments, what's the most clever, low-tech solution to a big problem you've ever seen? Bruno Calligaris was not a carpenter. He did not understand the intricate joinery of mortise and tenon that defined the sturdy salt-box homes of his neighbors. He was not a logger, nor a farmer, nor a frontiersman. He was a muratore, a secco, a man of stone. His hands understood the heft of granite, the sharp fracture of slate, the patient crumble of limestone. His mind worked in terms of interlocking masses, of gravity as the only necessary mortar. He came from Tarvisio, a town pressed against the Julian Alps, where the wind was a malevolent entity with a name, the Bora. It was a vicious, katabatic wind that poured down the mountainsides, capable of scouring a landscape clean. In his youth, he had built the gratis, the low, curved stone walls that shielded Alpine shepherd huts and livestock pens. They were never tall, never imposing, but their precise curve and placement could create a pocket of profound stillness in the midst of a gale. This was the knowledge he brought with him to America, a dowry of physics learned through his hands, not from a book. He had come with his wife, Elide, and their two small children, Marco and Sophia, chasing the promise of land and self-sufficiency offered to veterans. He had fought for this country, and in return it gave him a plot of stony ground and a surplus metal tube to call home. Their first winter, 1947, was a lesson in humility taught by the cold. They had a standard wood stove in their unshielded Quonset, and it consumed fuel with a ravenous appetite, yet the cold was relentless. It seeped through the thin metal skin. It radiated from the single-pane windows. It lived inside the walls. That winter's misery was measured in small, domestic catastrophes. One night, the hot water bottle Elide had placed between the sheets for 5-year-old Sophia froze solid, its rubber cracking with a sharp report in the frozen silence. In the morning, Bruno found the tin of aspirin tablets on their bedside table had become a single, useless disk of white, the pills welded together by the cold. He tried to write a letter to his brother back in Italy, but the ink in his fountain pen had frozen, and when he warmed it by the stove, the expanding fluid split the bakelite cap. They survived, but it was a shivering, diminished kind of survival, huddled together under every blanket they owned. Bruno swore his family would not endure another winter like it. He would not fight the Adirondack winter with fire alone. He would fight it with stone. He would teach his new, thin-skinned American house how to hide, the way an old Alpine hut knew how. The problem with the post-war Quonset hut wasn't the stove. The problem was physics, specifically the brutal efficiency of convective heat loss when amplified by wind. A standard log cabin with its 12 inches of insulating wood and chinking had a certain thermal mass. It could hold onto a BTU of heat for a while. The Quonset, a marvel of wartime engineering designed for rapid deployment in temperate climates, had the thermal properties of a tin can. Its corrugated steel skin, less than a 1/16 of an inch thick, offered practically zero insulation. Its R value was a rounding error. In still air at 0 degrees Fahrenheit, a powerful wood stove could keep the interior tolerable, at least in the half of the hut nearest the fire. But the Adirondack winter was never still. The wind was a constant scouring force. When a 30-mile-per-hour wind hit a surface, the effective temperature, the wind chill, plummeted. That wind acted like a thief, stripping heat from the metal skin thousands of times faster than still air could. Every BTU the stove produced was almost instantly sucked away into the atmosphere. The metal was so cold that moisture from their breath would flash freeze on the interior walls, coating them in a layer of feathery, glittering frost. You could write your name in it. The other families in the valley with Quonsets faced the same battle. The Cheneys, 2 miles down the road, had installed a second stove, doubling their fuel consumption. They were burning through their wood pile at an alarming rate. Frank Cheney confessed to Bruno at the general store that his children slept in their coats and hats. The Millers, a young couple with a newborn, had tried tacking insulating tar paper to the interior, but the condensation that formed between the paper and the metal turned it into a soggy, useless mess that soon froze into stiff, icy sheets. The conventional wisdom was Latimer's wisdom. Build a house around the house. Use the Quonset as an inner shell, and erect a standard insulated wood frame around it. It was a sound idea, but it cost money and time that Bruno Calligaris did not have. He had stone, and he had knowledge. By mid-September, Bruno's wall was complete. It stood 10 feet tall at its highest point, a graceful, powerful crescent whose horns tapered to the ground. The base was a full 5 feet thick, a massive foundation of the largest stones he could move, tapering to about 2 feet at the top. He had laid each stone with meticulous care, canting them slightly inward, so gravity itself locked the structure together. The curve was perfect, a section of a circle with a radius of nearly 40 feet. It stood 16 feet from the northern face of the Quonset hut, a detached, silent guardian. Elide had watched him work all summer, bringing him water and bread. "It is a beautiful wall, my love," she said one evening, her voice soft. "It looks like the walls near your uncle's malga in the mountains. But the neighbors, they think you are building a ruin." "Let them," Bruno said, his English simple and direct. He wiped his hands on a rag. "This is not a wall to keep things out. It is a wall to make the wind go around." Roy Latimer made his final official visit in early October. He walked the length of the wall, kicking at its base with his boot. The stone didn't budge. He squinted at the Quonset behind it. "Calligaris," he began, his tone heavy with bureaucratic finality, "I'm posting the assessment tomorrow. This property is rated Class 5, non-dwelling. That wall is an unpermitted agricultural structure. It's shed grade, and I can't in good conscience approve any VA-backed loans for improvements until you front this hut with a code-compliant, 4-side wood frame." The criticism was specific, technical, and delivered with the full confidence of local authority. It was an economic threat. A Class 5 rating meant higher insurance, no loans, and the official judgment of the community that he was living in a glorified shed. Bruno simply looked at Latimer, then at the wall, then at the sky to the north, which was the color of slate. "The wood frame fights the cold," he said quietly. "My wall teaches the house to hide. We will see which is better." He turned and went back to splitting wood, leaving the assessor standing alone in the shadow of his work. The science behind Bruno's wall was elegant, a quiet partnership of two distinct physical principles. The first was aerodynamics. A solid, flat wall facing the wind creates turbulence and eddies. But a curved wall, a gradis, behaves differently. It coaxes the wind. As the powerful north wind flowed toward the crescent, the concave shape would catch it, lift it, and guide it smoothly up and over the top. This created a large wind shadow, a pocket of relatively calm air in the lee of the wall. This aerodynamic wake, a cone of stillness, extended for a distance roughly 4 times the height of the object that created it. Bruno's 10-foot wall threw a 40-foot cone of calm that completely enveloped the vulnerable northern face of his Quonset hut. The effect on wind chill was dramatic. On a day with an ambient temperature of 38 Dopplers, a 30 mm wind creates a wind chill of 82 on an exposed surface. But inside that wind shadow, with the wind speed reduced to less than 5 mm, the effective temperature on the Quonset's metal skin was only 54 degree Oworth. That 28-degree difference represented a colossal reduction in the rate of heat loss. It was the difference between burning a log every 30 minutes and burning one every 2 hours. The second principle was thermal mass and radiative heat. The wall was 5 feet thick at its base, a colossal mass of stone and packed earth weighing well over 100 tons. All day, even in the weak winter sun, that dark stone absorbed solar radiation. Stone heats slowly, and it cools slowly. It acts as a thermal battery. As dusk fell and the temperature plummeted, the surrounding landscape quickly radiated its heat away into the clear, dark sky. But Bruno's wall, saturated with the day's energy, began to release it back into the space between the wall and the hut. This wasn't a blast of heat you could feel, but a gentle, persistent emission of long-wave infrared radiation. It created a microclimate in that 16-foot gap. The wall had a thermal lag of approximately 14 hours. It was still giving back the previous afternoon's sun long after midnight, At the coldest part of the night, it didn't just block the wind. It actively warmed the air that touched the house. It was a shield that fought back. That December, the winter came not as a storm, but as a presence. An Adirondack cold dome, a vast, heavy mass of Arctic air, settled over the high peaks and refused to move. For 9 consecutive days, the thermometer at the Saranac Lake Post Office never rose above 30° Franks. At night, in the low-lying valleys like the one where Bruno had settled, the cold pooled and deepened, dropping to 38 degrees and staying there. The air was so cold, it felt solid, a physical weight on the lungs. The snow, fine and dry as sand, was squeaked underfoot. Then, lake effect bands off Champlain began to stream inland, dumping 18 inches of powder across 2 nights, burying the world in a silent, frigid blanket. For the Cheneys and the Millers, it was a state of siege. They burned through their wood piles, their stoves glowing a dull cherry red day and night. Still, the frost crept inward, a thick white rind on the metal walls. Their windows were opaque with ice. Life shrank to the small circle of warmth around the stove. At the Calligaris' home, life went on. The wood stove burned, but it burned gently, its damper nearly closed. A single load of seasoned maple would last for hours. The north-facing wall of the Quonset, the one nestled in the calm air behind the stone crescent, was cool to the touch, but it was not coated in ice. In the small root box Bruno had built against that wall, a space that in any other Quonset would be frozen solid, their vegetables were perfectly preserved. The most telling sign was a simple, domestic act. Every 2 days, Elide would mix flour, water, and yeast. She would place the bowl on a small shelf on the north side of the hut, the coldest side. In the gentle, still air of the wind shadow, shielded from the brutal convective theft of the cold, the yeast would slowly, patiently do its work. The smell of rising bread dough filled their small home, a scent of impossible normalcy in the heart of the great cold. The numerical contrast was stark. Outside the wall, the wind chill was 80 degrees. Inside the wind shadow, it was a merely frigid 52 degrees. But the image contrast was more powerful. At the Cheney house, water for washing froze in the basin a few feet from the stove. In Bruno's house, 7-year-old Marco sat on the floor, far from the stove, carefully assembling a model airplane, his fingers nimble and warm. On the 7th day of the cold snap, Roy Latimer set out on skis. He had a survey to conduct on a parcel of state land 2 ridges north of the Calligaris place. It was miserable work. The cold was a physical pain, and the wind had a razor's edge. By late afternoon, as dusk began to bleed purple into the gray sky, he turned for home, the wind now directly in his face. He was a mile from Bruno's property when he felt the sickening lurch of equipment failure. The metal toe piece on his right ski binding had cracked in the cold. He cursed, his breath turning to instant frost. He couldn't fix it here, exposed on the open ridge. The wind was brutal, stealing the dexterity from his fingers in seconds. Then he saw it through the trees. The dark, curving shape of Calligaris's folly. Shelter. It was the only option. He pulled his way down the slope, his broken ski flapping uselessly. He stumbled into the space between the stone wall and the Quonset hut and collapsed against the stones. The change was instantaneous and profound. It was the physical equivalent of a door slamming shut on the wind. One moment he was in a gale, the next, near total stillness. The roaring in his ears stopped. He could feel the blood, painful and prickly, begin to return to his frozen cheeks. He leaned his back against the stone. He expected the cold of the rock to suck the warmth right out of his coat. Instead, he felt a strange neutrality, almost a hint of warmth, radiating through the thick wool. It made no sense. He fumbled inside his parka, his fingers clumsy, and pulled out his pocket thermometer. He'd used it an hour ago on the ridge. It had read 37 degrees. He hung it on a nail he found sticking out of the Quonset wall and went to work on his binding, pulling out a small pair of pliers and some wire. It took him 10 minutes of frustrating, focused effort. His hands, which should have been numb and useless by now, remained functional. When he finally secured the wire and stood up, he remembered the thermometer. He unhooked it and held it up in the fading light. The mercury was steady at 13 degrees, 24 degrees warmer. He stared at the number, his mind refusing to process it. He stepped out from behind the wall, back into the wind. The cold hit him like a physical blow. He held out the thermometer, and in less than a minute, the mercury plunged back down past 30 degrees. He stepped back into the calm. It rose again. He did this 3 times, as if verifying a miracle. He stood there for a long time, looking from the silent, massive wall to the simple metal hut it protected. He understood. He had been assessing a house. Bruno Calligaris had been sculpting the wind. You didn't build a wall, Latimer thought, his mind forming the words with a sense of awe. You built a harbor in the wind. He walked to the door of the Quonset, his face drained of its usual certainty, and knocked. When Bruno opened it, Latimer didn't offer an apology. He just said, his voice quiet, "Bruno, you need to teach me how this works." The winter finally broke in February. When the thaw came, the stories of hardship emerged. Families told of burst pipes, of livestock lost, of vegetables in their root cellars turning to black, rotten mush. The proof of Bruno's genius was not in thermometers or wind speeds, but in something far more elemental: a cabbage. In April, when Silas Croft visited, Bruno took him to the root box against the north wall. He pulled out a head of cabbage. It was green, crisp, and dense. He tapped it with his knuckle. It sounded solid. "We ate cabbage all winter," Bruno said simply. Silas shook his head. "Mine were mush by January. Froze solid, then rotted. Every last one." He held Bruno's cabbage in his hands as if it were a trophy. Word of the Calligaris cabbage spread faster than any story about temperature differentials. It was proof a man could taste. Roy Latimer, true to his word, became Bruno's greatest advocate. He used his position as assessor to document the performance of the hut. He measured wood consumption, recording that Bruno used less than a third of the wood of his neighbors in identical Quonsets. He took Bruno's hand-drawn sketches of the wall's dimensions and curve and had them professionally drafted. He knew there were hundreds of veterans across the state living in these surplus huts, fighting the same losing battle against the cold. He sent a letter and the blueprint to the Veterans Administration's monthly journal, Housing the Returning Soldier. He titled his article, "A Lesson in Ancient Physics for the Modern Homesteader." The editors were skeptical until Latimer included the notarized affidavits from Silas Croft and 2 other neighbors, alongside a week-by-week chart of comparative wood consumption. The article ran in the March 1949 issue. The response was immediate. Letters poured in from across the Northeast. Veterans who had been on the verge of abandoning their Quonsets saw a lifeline. The design was simple, the materials were often free for the gathering, and the result was proven. That summer, a strange new form of architecture began to appear in the Adirondacks, the Catskills, and the Green Mountains of Vermont. Men began hauling fieldstone, building their own protective crescents. By the fall of 1949, 31 Adirondack Quonset homes were shielded by a variation of Bruno Calligaris's windbreak wall. The idea spread not through formal channels of architecture or engineering, but through the practical grapevine of people who simply needed to stay warm. What Bruno Calligaris had built out of old-world memory was a startlingly advanced piece of environmental design. He had no vocabulary for it, but he had created a passive system that anticipated the principles of modern building science by decades. The concept of using berms or landscape features to alter airflow around a structure is now a fundamental part of sustainable architecture, often modeled with sophisticated computer software. His use of the wall as a thermal battery, absorbing solar energy and re-radiating it at night, is the very essence of passive solar design, a cornerstone of energy-efficient construction. He had, without formal training, mastered the interplay of convection, radiation, and thermal mass. He had treated the environment not as an enemy to be walled out, but as a system of forces to be understood and redirected. Modern engineers would call it a turbulence shield or a radiant baffle. Bruno just called it a wall. It was a reminder that the laws of physics are constant, and the wisdom to use them can be found not just in textbooks, but held in the collective memory of a trade. The quiet genius of Bruno's solution was not in its strength, but in its understanding. The frontier mindset, born of necessity, often defaulted to brute force, thicker walls, bigger fires, more insulation. It was a direct fight, a war against the cold. Bruno Calligaris did not declare war. He was a diplomat. He knew the wind was too powerful to fight head-on. You could not stop it, but you could persuade it. You could offer it a path of less resistance, a smooth, curved surface that would guide it away, leaving a pocket of peace in its wake. He didn't shelter the metal house against the cold in an act of defiance. He asked an old wall, born of an ancient mountain wisdom, to teach a new house how to hide. It was a profound act of humility, an acknowledgement that the most effective solutions often come not from confrontation, but from a deep and respectful listening to the world as it is. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this lesson in stone and wind as fascinating as I did, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more tales of practical genius. We love hearing from you, so please share your thoughts in the comments below. What other lost technologies do you think deserve to be remembered? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect. However, the techniques and scientific principles discussed are based on real historical practices and established physics. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional engineering standards. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.